Hello and welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast. This podcast relates the realities of Arab women and their rich and diverse experiences. It aims to present the multiplicity of their voices and wishes to break overdue cultural stereotypes about women of the Middle East. Season 5 is a collaboration between Musawah and Women of the Middle East podcast. As we will be discussing Musawah's latest book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage Towards Egalitarian Ethics and Laws, published by One World Academic in December of 2022. My name is Amal Malki. I'm a feminist, scholar, and an educator.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hello and welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast. Season 5 discusses the groundbreaking book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. In this episode, we zoom into Section 4, Law and Practice. Our second guest, the author of Justice, Refinement and Beauty, Reflections on Marriage and Spirituality, Dr. Shaikh. Dr. Sadia, welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast.
Thank you very much, Amal. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure having you. Now, the question I ask all of my guests is, what did attract you to become a contributor in this book? Could you tell us more about this, your contribution to the book?
So I, of course, have been working with Musawah for a while and contributed to a previous collection that was edited also by authors and by the organization of Musawah. And I think it's a kind of a commitment to a broader vision of Islam and of Muslim ethics and of gender justice. And so this particular group of scholars, for me, a very inspiring group of scholars, and I was incredibly honored to be asked to contribute to this volume, because I think we share a common vision of how to imagine a different way of being Muslim in the world today that is aligned to a deeper sense of, or that attempts to be aligned to a deeper sense of justice and beauty. So it's a wonderful group of scholars whose work I have an enormous amount of respect for, and about a collective vision of building something together.
Absolutely. Now, in your chapter, you forward the idea that for a believer, marriage constitutes a workshop for human divine encounters. You consider how to cultivate spiritually nourishing marriages that are based on justice and beauty through rituals, contracts, and day-to-day practice. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, sure. My approach is pretty much based on thinking around how we would look at marriage as a space or a workshop for the self, because ultimately, within the Muslim tradition, a central or a foundational part of the tradition is to be thinking about what does it mean to be in a relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what does it mean to be in a relationship to other human lives in a way that enables our deepening of the spirit, our deepening of the self, our deepening of the divine qualities. And so I frame this very much in a kind of, in a framework of thinking through some theological ideas, which then have a resonance with relationships. And so I frame the discussion as a workshop for spirituality, as a workshop for marriage as a space for refinement. And this comes out of a particular Islamic worldview that thinks about the nature of God and the nature of human beings. And so the idea of rahmah, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's idea of Allah's rahmah extends and embraces all things, the Quran says. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says also in the Quran, my mercy prevails over my wrath. And so this idea of a kind of divine rahmah as grounding all of existence and the divine is a central way in which I kind of think through, how do we then translate these into human relationships, and then a human being within this worldview. And there's, kind of a deep genealogy of thinking about the human being within various spiritual traditions of Islam as a constellation, a combination, a mixture, a reflection or a microcosm of the divine attributes. And so how do we align these divine attributes in the world? The argument that I'm making is based on tradition and based on the Quran and based on the prophetic tradition. There is what Muslim thinkers would call jamali qualities and jalali qualities, qualities of beauty and qualities of majesty. And really the alignment between these and the integration and the kind of balance in achieving a specific kind of subjectivity, a specific kind of personhood, a specific kind of relationship in the world, requires a balance of these. And our indicators from all of the sources is that that balance requires more Jamal than Jalal. As I've noted, the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah supersedes and embraces all things. All of the Quran, all of out of the 114 chapters of the Quran, 113 of them commence with a basmallah. So in the name of Allah, the most lovingly compassionate, the most merciful. So this idea of a rahmah as kind of framing the Quran, so that even our approach to interpreting and reading the Quran is prefaced by these kind of very jamali qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in some sense, it's asking us to enter the Quran through this portal, through this doorway, through this window of rahmah. Everything we read should be read and inscribed to rahmah. Our Prophet ﷺ has been called Rahmatul Alameen, the mercy to all of the world. So when we read the Sunnah, when we read the Hadith tradition, that is the portal to understand and to kind of, enter into that kind of way of thinking about personhood, about subjectivity, about what kind of ideal person one wants to be. And the point that I make in the article also is that Aisha radiallahu anha, who was, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, kind of commented that he was the embodiment of the Quran. And so what might it take to embody the Quran? And the fact that he is embodying this divine message in his relationship to his wife, that she is commenting on it, helps us to understand that the spiritual life and religious ethics must bear fruit, not only in the public sphere, as I argue, but also in our intimate, interpersonal relationships. So I think what this allows us to be, what I call a Jamali ethics. So Jamali ethics is to nourish and to think about what does it mean for rahmah, for believers who are lovers of God, of the Quran and the Prophet. We are invited at numerous levels to bring upon ourselves and into our relationships loving compassion and mercy. And so the question is, how do we then integrate this into our marriages? And that's kind of how I frame this kind of approach to be thinking about marriage.
Beautiful. And following up on this, basically, in what ways could nikah, marriage practices and rituals be more gender just, inclusive and spiritually fulfilling for all parties? How do we bring that into the marriage contract, the day-to-day practices?
So, I'm probably a lot of my piece looks to how we might bring it in the day-to-day living realities of marriage. Let me first say that one of the things that I do write about is that the actual nikah ceremonies themselves, both the contract and the ceremonies, we need to be thinking about important and socially relevant ways in which we can bring questions of rahmah, of justice, and for me, justice is integral to this balance. Not just for me, but I can speak to why justice is so central when we're thinking justice is the foundation of how beauty can emerge. We cannot have beauty without a kind of justice that is foundational to that. And so, on the one hand, I want to note that the nikah contract is something that's that's the way in which we might institute forms of justice and beauty. In my community, as I write in the article, it's often the case that women are not don't think very much about the nikah contract. They're not given the resources, the kinds of information, the ways of thinking about how to negotiate a contract, and the power, so to say. So that's the one part I think that requires a significant amount of work. And Muslim feminist scholars and other Muslim scholars are doing work on how we can rethink those contracts. But secondarily, and I think equally important for our community and for our imagination and for how we're thinking about just rituals. When we have a ritual, I don't know what the norms are in the communities that you come from, but in the community that I come from in South Africa, it's not unusual for the husband and the fathers to come to the woman in the home, ask her permission, and her father would normally actually speak for her in that case. So she doesn't even verbalize her own response. She's simply present. Then they go to the masjid, which is where the official kind of ceremony happens. So the woman is actually absent in all of that. And the question that I ask is that if we're starting off this very central ritual by women being invisible and being silent, it does not bode well for thinking around, entering into a space of partnership, of mutuality, of justice and equality. So we need to rethink our rituals. And I think this is also quite different depending on the context you come in. So in our context in South Africa, the way in which we've been urging many women to basically speak, as part of the contract, to think through what the contract entails, but to be an equal partner. If you're not an equal partner, even in the ritual or even in thinking through the more important contractual parts of that marriage, it doesn't bode well for how we might think of working through. So that's really thinking about the ritual. But then a lot of the article that I of my paper in this book is looking at how we might think of marriage as inner work. And what that would look like, what would that look like? Inner work, spiritual work. A lot of the ways in which we think about this, and I draw a deep inspiration from a number of teachers, and I quote in this work the Shaikh Muhammad Rahim Ba Muhyiddin, who was a Sufi teacher and who writes a beautiful little book on love. And he says that unless love is connected to Allah, unless it's connected to truth, to compassion, to justice, and to grace, it's possible for it to break down. And so in my article, or in this particular paper, I speak about what that would look like. How would we imagine, so if we're connecting love to questions of truth, what does that mean? And I speak to questions of what being in a relationship of comfort, of honesty, of candor, of truthfulness. And that can only happen when you are genuinely in a reciprocal relationship with somebody, where you are frank and you can be unguarded and there's a space to be authentic. And so the question is, what creates that comfort, being comfortable in your skin with your partner? That allows it. And then I speak to, what that might look like when you have truth and honesty. Sometimes that can be harsh to hear. And so the idea of rahma being connected to that truthfulness, so that one is compassionate in how compassion mediates the quality of a kind of a sharp honesty. When honesty has the potential to become brutal, it's the compassion that holds the honesty with tenderness and allows marriage to become a space of comfort. So that's the one dimension. And then I argue very strongly that justice is essential to love in this way, right? So that And justice is not just kind of the outer justice. Justice is also what you bring at the inner level. And so one example of this is I say that when we're in marriage, and one of the ways to be just to a partner is not to simply say in moments of frustration and irritation, and we all have that in marriage, right? Where you're perhaps seeing the same irritating quality happening for 100 times. Instead of focusing and zoning in just on that, oh, this person is so annoying, justice requires at the inner level that even in moments that are difficult, we don't only focus on one aspect of our spouse, that we constantly see the fullness of who somebody is and try to bring that kind of inner justice. So you're not looking partially or selectively or biasedly at this individual. You're engaging them with the fullness of who they might be. And that requires inner attentiveness, right? And so, those are the dimensions, and I have some very practical things that I also speak to. I don't know if you'd like me to speak to that in more detail.
Oh, definitely. It was very beautiful to read your chapter. You speak about the rituals of nikah, and it's really interesting that it's very similar to our part of the world as well. And I see those rituals mainly driven by traditions rather than really religious practices. And for myself and for many women around me, I don't think we've even seen the contract of marriage, that we've signed. That we never read the contract of marriage.
So Fatima Sidat, Dr. Fatima Sidat, who is based at the University of Cape Town as well, is currently doing some interesting work, which is not currently published, but she's doing some really interesting work around thinking through marriage contracts that's not premised, because historically marriage contracts are premised on the nikah contract in Islamic law is premised on a model of ownership. Keisha Ali has done enormous amounts of work revealing that in her legal scholarship. And so Fatima's kind of more constructive and creative work is to bring to the table other ways? What are contracts of partnership within Islamic law, and how could you rethink? Mahar should no longer be a gift of purchasing effectively access to a woman's sexuality. Mahar could become, if we rethink it very creatively and constructively, could become an exchange of gifts. So I think we need to be really open. And I think this also premise is also related to a construct of religion. We need to rethink the tradition, not as something that we are inheritors of and need to take on as a kind of way of belonging, but also to creatively engage how tradition can be meaningful in our contemporary terms with our evolving sense of justice and spiritual alignment and the idea of being in relationships of rahmah and of beauty and of justice. And justice is an unfolding thing. Justice is never set. What justice means, for the fuqaha in the 10th century versus the 15th century versus the 21st century should be very different things, because justice itself happens as a dynamic relationship to the outer. The ayat on the horizon and the ayat within ourselves and the ayat in the text should be in a dynamic relationship of unfolding. And so, what I'm trying to do in my article also is to foreground what those relationships might look like if we take seriously the inner work of spiritual alignment and inner justice and justice in our outer relationships. Because the other point that we're trying to make, incidentally, I don't know if you know this, Amal, but we have a book called the Women's Khutbah book that has just been published between Fatima Sidat and myself. We've co-edited and we have a whole bunch of contributors to that book. And we have a set of niqah khutbahs in that book, which, engages questions very strongly of how to be rethinking in this time and this space. But it's also to say that tradition has historically always been made in relationship to realities on the ground and must continue. We are co-creators of a tradition. Muslim communities from time immemorial have always created Islam in lived, actual, dynamic, engaged, spiritually alive and socially responsive ways, and we should continue to do so. And so rethinking nikah contracts, rethinking nikah ceremonies, rethinking the ways in which we engage with one another. And if we're doing it from an Islamic framework, we have to ground this, I argue, like many other people, in this idea of a Jamali ethics, because that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes, Allah's self as, what the Prophet ﷺ is described as, and what human beings are supposed to be aligning within ourselves. So my chapter kind of offers some ways to be thinking about that, as do all of the amazing other pieces in the book.
Beautiful, beautiful. I really enjoyed reading your chapter. Thank you so much, Dr. Sadia. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your contribution to this groundbreaking book.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much, Amal. Thank you for having me.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of Season 5. To stay up to date with Women of the Middle East podcast, you can subscribe and don't forget to rate us. If you would like to contact me directly, you can do so on Instagram or Twitter or via email.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.